The start of the year is usually seen as the quiet time in YouTube land, as it is in most other places. You don't get that many big releases in January. And so I thought it best to chill out and play some of my old favourites. It's rare that I get an opportunity to do so nowadays. But of course there was a purpose to it, and this was it, to bring you my top 100 games of all time. It's something I've wanted to do forever but always kinda resisted. I think though that now is the right time to do it. And well, I can't ramble too much, we have 100 games to get through, and you know that I tend to be a bit long-winded. So, without any further ado, let us begin. There is no way, really, that The Godfather should have been as good as it was. It was a ridiculously expensive production, reports filled with the amount of people who weren't going to be involved, Francis Ford Coppola himself saying that it was going to be a shit show that he wanted no part of, and well, it's the freaking Godfather. Licensed games usually deal with movies that aren't exactly good, let alone a classic like this one. And yet, I love this game. Regardless of the plot that tries its best to shoehorn your character into all the movie's classic scenes, this is a game where you go around 1940s New York and terrorise all 5 boroughs, extorting businesses, punishing those who cheek you on the street. There is a genius to the maximum bastardry that you can go about doing. And it still has one of the best shooting and cover systems in any sandbox game too. I've played this game through so much it couldn't not be in the top 100. Shame then that, quite unlike the movie, the sequel was a steaming pile of crap. Comix Zone is a unique beast for many reasons, and not just because of its signature presentation. A side-scrolling fighter that's often based around getting through situations as quickly as possible without losing tons of health in the process, this was an obvious jewel from the Mega Drive's late period, to the point where after years of it being called a hidden gem, we can pretty safely say that it's amongst the console's best-loved titles by now. Some may say that Sketch Turner's Adventures deserved more than just the single game that it got, but it's probably better that it stayed here. Something like Comix Zone just wouldn't feel right anywhere else. Big Daddy Chucky Egg is one of the first games I can remember loving, being addicting and constantly pulling you in for just one more go. It was simple enough then for a 5-year-old kid to have fun with it, and the same is still true nearly 30 years later. Without having actually been to the arcades itself, Nigel Alderson's gem gave you a big shot of arcade play on the micros. It feels like it should have been a classic from Namco or Data East or whoever, even though it wasn't. It's still going to be just as good as this 30 years further down the line, when the oldest gits of us all are still undoubtedly going to be fighting over the most accurate ways that 20-core, 512GB frost bastard computers can play games from the early 1980s. The first game on this list that's universally regarded as a classic, the original Castlevania, is the first of 3 entries for the Belmonts and Company on the list. For me, it's absolutely the best of the 8-bit outings. Plenty would say that Dracula's Curse is more impressive, and there's probably a few perverse folk who'd go for Simon's Quest, but right from the start when Vampire Killer kicks in, this has just always been the one. A Ghost House style journey through classic horror images and ghost stories that's never not fun and never not annoying when, once again, a Medusa head knocks you back into the abyss. Aladdin on the Mega Drive should never have been as good as it was. A chaotic dev cycle and frenetic switch from one studio to another meant that the people involved had mere months to put it all together. And yet they did. And while everyone is always going to gawp at the sheer quality of the graphics and how well the game captures the delights of the movie, it's always worth saying that it actually plays pretty damn good too, with creative and often challenging levels, crafty sword fighting and apple chucking, and the odd bit of bracing fun on a magic carpet. There's plenty of reasons why this was the best selling game on the Mega Drive that wasn't named Sonic, and it certainly deserved that accolade. Football games on the top 100? You're goddamn right. I've played these games forever, and it'd be damn foolish to ignore them. Pro Evo 4 is the best of the PS2 generation. From a time when FIFA was awful for so many reasons, Konami had you covered. Sure, it didn't have as many licenses, meaning that it was filled with bowdlerised names of players, teams and stadiums. Yes, the commentary from Trevor Brookin and the now sadly departed Peter Brackley was always amusingly stilted. It might not have been the cool game, but anyone who knew football knew it just wasn't even close. This was the best football you could get, and it's still fun to play now. PES will forever be an alternative and an all-important counter to FIFA, and that gap was never larger than it was with this instalment. Ocean's side-scrolling licensed game bashed the doors down, a license obtained for a pittance that resulted in arguably the Spectrum's most successful game. RoboCop's success was a blessing and a curse that arguably made the Manchester Giants games a lot more formulaic. But here on the Spectrum at least, and absolutely not on the C64 where it's horrific, it's still magic. The mix of side-scrolling as well as the odd minigame makes for an entertaining half hour that's still lots of fun to get through, even if, like me, you probably know everything that's coming. Much like the film. I know everything that's coming in that too, but that's not going to stop me watching it whenever it's on. On the Specky, it's undoubtedly one of the best of its kind. Now, this could be a shocker. I'll say it now. Space Harrier 1 didn't make the list. List did. Space Harrier 2. Why? I mean, surely it's a kind of inferior retread of an immortal arcade classic. And, well, yeah, it is. I still love this game though, because it did, as Sega used to say, bring the arcade experience home. It's very much still Space Harrier, fast gameplay, cracking music, all of that. But I guess the reason why this made it is because I can't deny that every time I play it, I complete it. Or try to, but mostly complete it. Ages ago, I said of World Cup Italia 90 that it was a game I played when I couldn't think of anything else to play. Space Harrier 2 is kind of like that as well, with the difference being that it's actually pretty bloody good. Not bad for the first game ever released on the Mega Drive. This is a NES classic through and through, almost an archetypal one. Is it colourful? Yes. Does it have good music? Yes. Is it really bloody difficult? Most certainly yes. Is it by Capcom? Yes. Little Nemo is the poster child for classic NES platformers, complete with the twist of using all that candy to morph into various creatures in order to grab those keys. There are perhaps many other similar games that could have taken this spot: Mr. Gimmick, Panic Restaurant, Little Samson, Bucky O'Hare, but today the spot goes to Nemo because in the end, it's just so bloody charming. And it's another chance to stick a licensed game on the list to boot. Normally being a spy in a video game means there's going to be lots of stealth manoeuvres, but also blown covers, shootouts and explosions. That's what happens on the ground. But Floor 13 is different. It puts you in the role of the spy master. Essentially, you're a civil servant who has to keep a low profile, nipping various potential crises for the government in the bud, with a hard-to-please and hot-tempered Prime Minister never far away, and a secret society lurking further behind the shadows. Those who constantly give out orders for assaults and removals won't last long in the job. Those who exercise discretion and caution may go far. Floor 13 is remorselessly grey and mundane, almost boring in the way it treats the clandestine path as little more than another city job. And it's for all that and more that I absolutely love it. Nostalgic attachment is obviously going to be a big thing on a list like this, and Golden Axe certainly has that. It was pretty much the first beat 'em up I ever played, or at least way up there. Kinda like Space Harrier 2 before it, it's a game I have to complete every time I play it. I certainly didn't have to do that for all the games in the 100, as that would be crazy, but I made sure to do it for this. And, well, why not? Especially here on the Mega Drive, it's a great little half hour, complete with the added challenge of Deathbringer at the end, even if I've been through it so much that every encounter is pretty much in my bones by now. The strings that hold it together may be well on display these days, and there'd certainly be better beat-em-ups to come on the Mega Drive, but Golden Axe was one of the games that just made it happen. Back to football then, with the best FIFA. Forget the monolithic cash grabs of today. The series has never beaten Road to World Cup 98. The all-important game that actually established FIFA as a 3D footy force after a couple of turkeys. Who knows where it would be if this game hadn't been so good. It's got just the right speed, just the right level of complexity while improving on the simple playability of the early 16-bit games. Hundreds of teams from a bygone age, and of course, indoor football, which is something that belongs in all modern football games, and I have no idea why it's not in there. Road to World Cup 98 is still very playable now when a lot of 3D FIFAs that came after it flat out aren't, and for all the bells, whistles, ultimate teams and admitted accuracy to the game that the latest incarnations possess, they just can't match 98's mix. It's not all old shit on this list. Derek Hughes' Spelunky is something altogether more modern and great. A journey down into the depths that I've happily bashed my head against for years, ever since it was a free game, and the inevitable big commercial version didn't disappoint. It's an experience that always changes, of course. It's never quite the same every time you play, and it was one of the first of a bunch of modern games to pull that roguelite style thing. It's like a weird living, or perhaps a badly constructed Rube Goldberg machine that's rioted away from its intended path, with every action seemingly locked together, but a big knack for the unexpected. And I'll still go back to it even if I've never actually come close to beating it. I'm bad at this game, but in every way it's just masterful. Robotron is like being bashed around the head, a quality it earns by assaulting you with the sort of sound you just don't get in games anymore. Early arcade games, Williams games in particular, just didn't seem to care about, being tasteful in that regard. You just get this all-out sonic assault as you're playing. There are other arena shooters, including other ones by Eugene Jarvis himself that could easily take this spot, but that assault makes me plump for the original. You just don't get that sort of thing in games anymore. But regardless of that, Robotron 2084 would, I am sure, be as much of a hit if released today as it was back then. Maybe that's the influence the game's look and feel has talking, but it's certainly never going to get old. A pretty recent addition to the 100 despite its age, Lost Patrol captured me thanks to a request for review last year. A dark and moody game from a time when Ocean was seemingly all about action tie-ins, Lost Patrol is the story of a group of men lost in the Viet Cong jungle, miles from safety, and your efforts to get them the hell out of there. It's filled with mini-games, the occasional interrogation, a bunch of strategy and a certain movie-esque presentation. It's born out of the Cinemaware style, but ends up trumping those games. Sure, after playing it a few times you learn the march and rest strategy that's likely going to take you to a relatively straightforward victory, but still, you get stories from this game, usually sad and depressing ones, and it's that narrative drive that even with little but a map screen to look at, keeps that dot pushing towards Du Hoc. Oh, and there's that relentless, brilliant bit of music too. The letter V 6 times, V6, VVVVVV. This is a game that's hard even to bring up in conversation, let alone play. One of the signature games from a whole wave of tough retro-inspired platformers, V6, as I call it, takes the classic microcomputer flick screen formula, silly room names and all, and modernises it by making you flip from floor to ceiling instead of jumping, as well as adding a great sense of adventure. This game stuck with me for a long time, and I adore it. I struggled not to just go totally through it once again, although I did have to at least get to one of my favourite challenges in all of games, Veni Vidi Vici. If you've ever played it, then you'll know what that's all about. Coming on like a hidden C64 gem and filled with cracking music, tons of secrets and hundreds of deaths, this one's so good it's even inspired tons of homebrew games that still come out on the old micros today. A top games list without Tetris is, as Samuel Johnson famously said, like a dog who speaks. Very rare. My favourite though is perhaps not the usual one. Tetris DX, the Game Boy Color version. It may not have had the iconic music or anything like that, but you know what it did have? 40 lines mode. The simple act of trying to make 40 lines as quickly as possible made this iteration of Tetris more addictive to me than any other version. This was the ultimate game to play on holiday as a result. It's actually quite funny. To date, the Game Boy Color is the only game system that was bought by my mum for herself, and though she does love this too, I kind of ended up taking it over a lot because I love this so damn much. It's still the only Game Boy Color game I own as it happens. The Chaos Engine. Oh man. The bitmap steampunk gauntlet 'em up is just one of many reasons why the Amiga was so brilliant. It takes an old classic formula and just piles on intensity. Whether it's the legendary portraits of those 6 hard-nailed guns for hire, or the appropriately strange surroundings and enemies, or the pumping rave music that spews out of it, it's fantastic. It's a wonder that it wasn't more successful on consoles, and a shame that it never got the sequel it truly deserved, but it still stands high as one of the best games from one of the UK's original Rockstar studios. This is not a place where you'll find me being sniffy about Mortal Kombat and saying that it just relied on gore to get over. In fact, even if there's arguably better games in the series, to the point where they're still pretty fun even now, the original's gotta make it. As an arcade experience, it completely stood out from everything else around it, and as a game it has that glorious pulpiness of a classic kung fu video nasty, while still being simple and very good. None of its imitators could ever hope to come close, and that wasn't just because MK was first, it's because it was better. Vice City is another pretty obvious one. It's the favourite GTA of many, one of the biggest games of the time, the one that showed GTA 3 wasn't a fluke at all, and still the best tribute to a Miami Vice and Scarface cocaine-packed neon 1980s that you can play with a controller. It's easy enough to gab about the play, the missions, the plot, the freedom and all of that, but it's kinda simple. When you're cruising down the ocean front while Mr. Mister plays and you're sinning without a care in the world, you know it's a bloody good game that's just got you by the balls. Gunstar Heroes. Treasure's classic, one of the best debuts of all time. It's pretty safe to say that they nailed it first time out. A veritable golden shower of hot action at all times, taken at a blinding pace with enemies coming out left and right, and of course many, many bosses. It's arguable that Treasure, as good as they were, never quite managed to surpass this first game. The irritation this Splinter Group felt at never quite being able to work on much original for Konami flooded into this title, and the result is quite the obvious legendary Mega Drive title. At the time especially, it just seemed like you couldn't do this on the Super Nintendo. Sticking with high-octane side-scrolling action, Elevator Action Returns takes a classic old arcade game and does an absolutely smashing job of updating it. It's never not fun. My favourite thing about it though is probably the way it looks. I love things like this where it's really zoomed out, you see multiple floors, and yet there's still lots of fun little details and animations to be picked out. Really makes this arcade action feel like it's got some life about it. And of course, explosions, bullets, bombs, blasts, booms, all that other good stuff. You can't exactly go on with this one. Metroidvanias are something that, by this point, are never going to go away. From big games to indie darlings, they're still right at the head of the pack. There's now one with a good adventure, and so here's a nod to the game that coined Metroidvanias. Symphony of the Night is a whopping reimagining of all that made Castlevania great, taking all that action and shoving it into a huge castle where you've got to try and make the best path through. So much to do, so much to see. It actually took me a while to properly get into, but once it hooked me, yeah, it's pretty deserving. Oh, and there's that cheesy ending song too, just to really ram the brilliance home. Not a bad game, all told. I feel a little uncomfortable when there's too many Universal classics in one go. Thankfully, we're back into good old Amiga territory. The original Settlers is most awfully nice, a mixture of town building and real-time strategy complete with, back in the day, a whopping manual and lots of cute icons for you to pore over and try and remember. The pace is a little bit more relaxed than a lot of other strategy titles, allowing you to happily mine and build before setting about wiping your enemies off the map, and it's all classically European and medieval. This series is actually still going, and I'm sure there's better games in it than this, but the original is the one I know, and it's certainly worthy of a spot. I can't not have my first PlayStation game here, pretty much my first proper 3D gaming experience. Tomb Raider 2 was the first to come after Lara Croft became something of a phenomenon, and sure, it's always going to give you a jolly good look at her curvy ass, and she's always going to walk through craggy terrain like a supermodel on the catwalk. That's just part of the awesome 90s-ness of it all, and the gameplay is still bloody great regardless, making this very much my favourite Tomb Raider. I mean, how could it not be this one? Doing the assault course and then locking the butler in the fridges? a rite of passage for any PlayStation fan. The original Ninja Gaiden. It might be the toughest game in the whole 100. It's a bloody amazing game of constant movement where you're almost not allowed to stop and basically have to try and flow as much as you can through these levels, as any time you're halted, you may end up dying pretty bloody quickly. This alone makes Ninja Gaiden different from a lot of other classic NES platformers, and it's a style of play that I absolutely adore. Obviously there's the cutscene integration, the music and all of that, but this game makes the list largely on account of it being one hell of a glorious, balletic beast in motion. Yep, Mega Drive Alien 3 makes it. Mainly due to atmosphere, the general dark settings and constant fear of a xenomorph popping out from anywhere make it a real edge of your seat affair. Sure, it's mostly maze-type levels where you rescue hostages, and no, it's not exactly an accurate representation of the film due to there being more than one alien in it, but I have a major soft spot for this game, and it's an absolute Mega Drive favourite. And that Matt Furniss soundtrack as well. I've loved this game ever since I saw it on an old magazine videotape, and it's still up there to this day. Bullfrog's theme park is quite the funny one. Sure, you could argue that there are better park construction games, but for me the amusing thing about theme park is that under the big old shell of woohoo, we've got this glorious sandbox where we can build the park of our childhood dreams, one's the cold hard streak of pure business and scheming capitalism. Let's put too much salt in the french fries so that people need to buy more drinks. Let's pump the coffee full of caffeine so that the punters move fast around the park and we increase our turnover. Let's negotiate with union reps over biscuits and stop them from striking. All sorts of things like that. And all the while you're trying to make sure that rides don't suddenly blow up and, injure the customers a little. Few games allow you to be both an affable ringmaster and a penny-pinching tightwad at the same time, but this most certainly does. Another modern indie classic, and another game that is all about flow. You'll notice that I love games that are all about moving fast, and this certainly is that. You try and rush through levels, brutally killing every scumbag in the area as fast as you can, with as many weapons as you can. Hack them with swords, blast them with guns, pour boiling water over their face, stove their head in with a bat. It's quite the orgy of violence. You may have to die a lot in order to get that perfect one through, but it's worth it. The trippy vibe, obvious drive influence, 80s mood and pumping music help a lot too. It's a definite modern great. Well, this is probably the most universally loved game yet, and it's the only Zelda game I've ever really gotten into. Why? Well, there's no actual reason. Many of the games have just passed me by, usually because I didn't have the system they came out on. I've not even played most of them. I've never played Ocarina of Time, for example. But this? Yeah, I have. And it's an absolutely fantastic action-adventure come RPG with lots of good puzzling, good dungeons to explore, and stonking presentation. I mean, shocking, right? Playing this makes me think that I should spend more time to actually get more familiar with one of gaming's foremost series, and, I may well do that. Someday. Probably. If I have time. Speedball 2 is a game that for many years was the first and last word in a whole subgenre. Future sports games weren't much to speak of until this came out, but afterwards barely any of them could hope to fill this game's shoes. Sure, there may not be all that many options, but hoo boy, there is nothing quite like the intensity of a Speedball 2 match. It is to future sports what sensible soccer is to football, a futuristic handball with plenty of end-to-end play and lots of ways to score points, including building up a team of absolute physical freaks who will cripple the opposition with every tackle. Until Rocket League, there was no other game that even came close to challenging its throne, and while that is great, this is still the undoubted Don. Yo ho and indeed ho. Again, it seems like a lot of people just thought there wasn't much point in creating free roaming pirate sims after this one. Where else could you go? Pirates may have some sort of overarching plot about finding your family and all of that, but really it's all about setting off on expeditions and just seeing where they take you. Who do you side with, if anyone? Will you stumble across some treasure? Maybe there's a chance to catch the silver train, find a family member, or court a potential wife. Every journey is different, and it keeps you coming back. As an aside, this could have easily been the more modern version, which is just as good, but I decided to go with the older title here. Either way, this game can and has kept me hooked for many hours. It seems like Windjammers is right now getting some long overdue respect as a classic arcade game. Certainly you've got lots of indie games that are heavily inspired by it, and while some of them are pretty okay, the original is still very much where it's at. It's lightning-paced futuristic tennis almost, where you're always looking for that big passing shot. Sometimes you might want to risk going forward to get the angle, sometimes you hand back and wait for the opportunity to launch a special or catch them out with the slow one. There are many ways to play this, making it more than just a game of chucking a disc back and forth. Get someone to play the game with you, and you're all set for a damn good time. Sports game wise, this list would frankly be incomplete without at least one of the classic NHL titles, and I've plumped for what is perhaps the most obvious one, 1994. With this one, the formula was basically solidified. You've got the tight controls, the one-timers, a great roster, and a fast and faithful recreation of the sport. For many people, no ice hockey game released since has managed to match this one, and of all EA's 16-bit sports games, yeah, none of them could hope to be better than this. They utterly nailed ice hockey in the 16-bit era, even if they struggled later on to actually do it again. At last we get to Sonic. Again, it's hard to think of what to say. This was the game that made me want to get a Mega Drive, my intro to the 16 bits. You know, same story as many other people, I'm sure. The original Sonic still holds up pretty damn well for me. The variation in zones, from the super speedy classic Green Hill and Starlight to the much slower Marble and Labyrinth, which I actually like, do still make it a bit of a meaty game to get through. Of course, there would be better to come, and obviously we'll be seeing that later on, but you know, it's still pretty good. And it's hard to think of anything better that would have really kicked the Mega Drive into the stratosphere as this game did. Konami's licensed beat-em-ups all have their merits, but The Simpsons? Yeah, easily the best. It's the one that on my weekly trips to the arcades I would absolutely have to play. It's kind of strange in many ways. It came so early in the life of the show that it's still full of stuff that you only found in its first season. Hell, it's not like The Simpsons could be seen by a lot of people here when this came out. We were fortunate enough to have satellite so we could, but it was a couple more years before it actually came to UK terrestrial television. But even if a lot of people couldn't watch it back in 1991, that didn't stop The Simpsons getting big. Do the Bartman was a #1 single, we had loads of the merchandise, and all the games, including this utterly legendary arcade romp. It brings back loads of memories while still just absolutely being fun. Thankfully, there's room on this list for one proper footy management game, and the winner is Premier Manager 3. It's got all the things you'd expect. There's plenty of stats and spreadsheets just to drive the point home that even if it is football, this is most certainly a game for the anoraks and nerds. But simply through forcing you to start with a conference team with the aim of taking them all the way to the top, Premier Manager 3 also has a sort of story to it, the promise of a big long journey. And while the stats are certainly there, this isn't the labyrinthine complexity of most modern day management titles. It's just got the right balance for this sort of game. Up Halifax Town! In the immortal words of Consolvania's Robert Florence, fucking Gitaroo Man. I actually specifically picked up this PS2 gem based on that show's recommendation, and it was utterly worth it. A rhythm game where you use the buttons and analog stick to make your way through a big old buzzwire of a ripping guitar set to some really kickin' rad music. It's got that parappa la rappa kind of feel, especially in the graphics and style, but just even better. In the end, the music makes it. Maybe this game wouldn't be half as good if it didn't have the likes of the legendary theme, but it does, and when that kicks in, it doesn't get much more glorious than that, to be honest. It fair brings a tear to your eye. I remember this being a game that kinda hit me out of nowhere. I hadn't played any Far Cry game prior to this one, and I've not touched the series since. And yet this is brilliant. There is of course a plot where a preppy college sort becomes a well-oiled killing machine that's all kinds of meta and does feature one of the best villains in modern gaming, but that's not why Far Cry 3 made it. It made it because it ends up being an awesome first-person free roamer, especially when you're taking those bases. It was so glorious to almost play with the enemy, to gradually set their whole encampment on fire, maybe unleash a few of their captive tigers and bears on them before ultimately picking them off one by one. There's nothing quite like hunting down badniks in this game's immersive and endlessly atmospheric jungle. The goal of Joust couldn't be simpler. You just have to get higher than your opponent, then you ram into them and take their head. Easy, right? And yet it's so much more. It's frenzied button mashing at just the right time, mastering the frosty controls, getting ready to dive, and then the satisfaction when you swoop on your enemy, especially when you then chain in to immediately bash in another one. Oh, and there's another whole load of brilliant early arcade sounds as well. It is the most straightforward of games, but it's also one of the most addictive and frantic arcade titles ever made. It takes something rather special to take what's usually a sedate and relaxing, or boring if you prefer, sport and turn it into pure grain excitement, which is exactly what Neo Turf Masters does. It makes golf seem like the funnest thing in the world without even doing anything all that gimmicky. You just crank that power bar and rip balls down the fairway, or get immense satisfaction from an approach close to the pin. It's presented phenomenally well, there's a lot of quite endearing broken English Japanese touches, there's the peppy music. It's a stroke of genius, a game that has no right being one of the best sports games ever made, which it absolutely is. A Spectrum title unlike no other, a game that takes place entirely within the confines of a school day. No other Specky game shoves quite as much personality into 48 kilobytes the way that Skool Daze does, with a whole building full of different characters. The cane-toting Mr. Whacker, untucked shirt wannabe cool teacher Mr. Wivet, the blackboard vandalising Boy Wonder, and the much-hated SWAT Einstein, just to name a few. You have to get through all of them and more if you want to light all the shields and take back Eric's report card. As endearingly British as they come, Skool Daze was another one of my first loves. It was quite considerably better than, actually going to school. One of the sad things about the monolith that Koei have rather become these days is that, well, they just don't make games like this one anymore. Way back when, their games were seemingly altogether stiffer. Some would even say boring. So why is it that a game about managing a frickin' airline trapped me so? It's the first game I think of when I recall the fun I had with the Sega channel, I suppose. Never released over here in the UK, Erebus Supersonic was on the service and we were one of the fortunate few who could access it. And it's so great! It's 20 years of constant battling for the #1 spot, getting your hubs together, business ventures, tinkering with routes. And as far as games like this go, it's implemented pretty bloody well on consoles. It doesn't sound like a majorly fun time, but trust me, it bloody well is. When superhero tie-ins get it right, they really nail it, as this shows. Arkham City takes a Metroidvania-style formula, sticks it in 3D, and unleashes the big black bat. The quality of the plot and the way that it goes about portraying Bats and his endless rogues gallery is more than good enough, but this just feels so awesome. Whether you're gliding around the city, or you're locked in a rapid-fire brawl with hordes of baddies, or you're playing Predator with a load of fools who think their guns are going to protect them, this is just so good, and the freer surroundings just give this the edge for me over the almost equally as great Arkham Asylum. Unsurprisingly for me, it's the best superhero game there's ever been. A second ice hockey game? Yep, EA isn't quite #1. As fast and furious as those 16-bit NHL classics might be, in the end they still have to bow down to the original kin. Konami's NES sports titles are mostly solid, but Blades of Steel? It's outrageous. It's on fire, in fact. Even NHL can't hope to keep up with this amazing goal-fest of a game where constant fights, brilliant goals, and unreal forward goalie duels are simply what comes naturally. Matches against the computer are fun enough, but with someone else to play with? Oh boy. It's more than deserving of a spot not just on the list, but right outside the top 50. It's no real surprise that the top licensed game on the whole list is this one, is it? I'm not even that big a Star Wars fan, at all, but TIE Fighter is something else. There's always something a little special about being able to play as the villains, isn't there? You may well be a lowly pilot at first, but soon enough you're building a glorious career in the Empire, surviving no end of dogfights, and generally being an ace. At least until you get shot down and locked up on a prison planet for a bit. But no matter, you can always fly again to the strains of the Imperial March. TIE Fighter, as a licensed property and take on the gargantuan franchise it's based on, is simply without equal. It might be hard to ignore the money-grabbing monolith that Call of Duty has become, but the entry that started all of that? An absolute belter. The first Modern Warfare at the time had a single-player campaign that was one of the best ever, paced so damn well, so many moments that were simply unforgettable, and a serviceable plot featuring Dan from EastEnders and Don Beach from The Bill. And the multiplayer, well, it was perfect. There wasn't all the unnecessary crap there is today, just straight ahead classic online action. The series would, of course, never come close to it again, for better or worse, one of the most important first-person shooters ever made. But regardless of that, it's the best Call of Duty has ever been. Jonathan Joffa Smith used up just about every byte of the Specky's memory to make this conversion of Green Beret. There wasn't even enough room by the development's end to allow you to go back to the title screen, let alone add in music. But it's so good that it didn't need it. It's already a fine arcade game, of course, but what you look for in a Specky conversion isn't necessarily accuracy, but feel. And hoo boy does this capture the feel of the arcade, the rush and attack if you will. A few of Joffa's typically idiosyncratic flourishes don't go amiss, but this is all about the constant stabbing of endless foot soldiers, and when you die, it's pretty hard not to stab once more just to start all over again. The signature work of one of the UK's greatest ever programmers. I can think of two tragedies associated with this game. The first being that it didn't get the recognition it deserved, the second being that Volition went in a completely different and much worse direction for the sequel that ended up stiffing the series. Red Faction Guerrilla is in many ways a typical shooty sandbox, or at least that's what it seems. But then there's the destruction which just changes everything. Everything from remote chargers, nano rifles, to the noble sledgehammer can be used to bring towering structures down to the ground, but it also adds a completely different dimension to fighting and the way you approach the game. It actually makes you kinda feel like a guerrilla. And the destruction in multiplayer? That made it a whole new ballgame. In fact, it was the best multiplayer game on the Xbox 360 and barely anyone bloody played it. If there is any justice in this world, this will one day finally be regarded as one of the best sandbox games ever made. The two groovy dudes from the planet Funkotron's original game was, of course, quite unique. A strange trip through an odd multi-layered planet Earth filled with quips, doofuses and poindexters where you've got to put your ship back together, find elevators and open all kinds of presents. Some good, some bad, some weird. Fuel for flat earthers the game may be, but it's undoubtedly one of, if not the best co-op multiplayer game on the Mega Drive. It sure is fun enough, but the glory of actually getting together with someone and trying to make it through is the reason why ToeJam Earl is all the way up here. And thankfully a proper sequel to this hilarious, riotous and utterly funky gem is now not all that far away. Koei make another appearance, this time with what was their absolute signature series. Indeed, where on earth would they be if they hadn't decided to make endless games out of a 14th century Chinese historical novel? Romance of the Three Kingdoms 3 is another Sega Channel gem, much like Aerobiz Supersonic, with feudal wars proving to be that little bit more exciting than airline management. Again, I could point to later entries, such as the excellent 8th game in the series which goes even deeper into a book and period that the company frankly know inside and out, but this is the one that just has the perfect balance between management, plotting and battle that sets you up for a truly epic tale, whether you choose to go down the historical or fictional route. It should be clear by this point that I am very much on the spectrum. It was my machine as a child, and I never had a Commodore 64 until a couple of years back, so few games from the system have managed to truly win my heart. But there is room for one, and it is, of course, Whizball. Sensible Software's fantastic breakout title invites you to add colour back into a grey world, and shows their genius way of working. You take something that could be a bog-standard shooter in the style of Defender, and you chuck in all these ideas, everything from a big chunk of Gradius to plain old stuff that's just way out there. And what you eventually end up with is a game totally on its own, unlike anything else around even now. For me, the best game on the Commodore 64. Considering my lack of experience, that may not mean much, but a lot of C64 experts tend to agree with me on this one. This was a tricky one. I spent a lot of time with Bethesda RPGs during a certain period in the mid-late 2000s, meaning a spot had to go to one of two games that generally get a beating these days for not aging well at all. This or Fallout 3. And in the end it's Oblivion that takes it. I mean, yes, this game doesn't have the personality of Morrowind, a game I never quite got the chance to get to grips with due to playing this first. It doesn't have the more modern panache of Skyrim, a game that came out long after I'd burned out on Bethesda RPGs, something which also kind of affected my time with New Vegas, which is objectively better than all of these and probably should be here instead. But what can't be ignored is that Oblivion kinda took over my life for at least a year, a lot of that through endless modding. When I think of modding up PC games, this is the title that springs to mind. And yes, a lot of those mods were for utterly ludicrous shit like Final Fantasy VII weapons that clipped through the ground, but there were plenty that actually improved the game, by a lot. Because, you know, that's obviously the hallmark of a true classic. But while the bare bones game may be more than a little bit daft nowadays, I can't ignore the time I spent with it. That absolutely massive, comically ludicrous amount of time. Another biggie enters the fray. This will be one of two entries dealing with Sid Meier's Civilization. Unlike, well, most people, my first experience of Civ was with the ARGA version on the Amiga, and it won't surprise you to learn that I used to leave my computer on for days just to keep the game going because, being young and an idiot, I never used to have blank floppy disks to hand. No wonder my original A1200's power supply ultimately crapped out. Anyway, it's much the same game on the Amiga. As the box says, you build an empire that stands the test of time, meaning in practice that you fuse yourself to your chair, always ready to see what the next turn is going to bring. Will you finally finish that wonder? Are you going to take that city? Are you about to stumble across Gandhi and his nuclear weapons? There's always something to keep you going, forever. Or at least until you've either completed the Apollo program or righteously wiped everyone else off the map. So addictive, it should have probably been illegal. Or at least heavily controlled. You can't exactly go wrong with Gauntlet to begin with, as great an arcade game as it is. But Gauntlet 4 is without a doubt the definitive version. Naturally you get the original game in a big way, but all the other modes, including the big old quest, certainly add a lot more variation. But even so, it's the amazing conversion that keeps bringing you back, with all the monsters, all the sound effects and the voices, even if they're in classic Mega Drive low quality, and the addition of an absolutely blistering soundtrack. A fitting package for this most iconic of games, and one that would be more than welcome today if it hadn't already come out in 1993, long before such tributes were really even a thing. The top Spectrum game on this list is next, and to the surprise of absolutely nobody, it's Deathchase. This 1983 title, again, couldn't be more straightforward. In a scene more than a little bit inspired by Star Wars, you ride your bike through a big old forest in pursuit of two bikers, the yellow one and the blue one, and you blow them up using an endless supply of missiles. As you progress through the sectors and the day and night patrol, the trees grow ever larger in number. Even if your prey is defenceless, those trees can certainly ruin your day. And so you end up with this ripple of a title, weaving in and out of dense forestry just to get that perfect shot, blowing some poor soul to smithereens. Never not satisfying, and never not constantly pulling you in for another go, even after you're picking teeth out of an oak for the 10th time in a single sitting. The crude graphics just kind of fit too. It is the definitive and greatest game on the UK's signature computer. It took a fair bit of time for Hitman to really get off the ground. The first game wasn't all that much of a signifier of things to come, the next two got that little bit closer without quite making it, and then came Blood Money, which absolutely nailed every single idea of what a Hitman game could be. It made good on all the promise that Hitman had as a stealth assassination game, something altogether different, with these grand, often rather gothic levels that feel so atmospheric and lived in. Even more so as Agent 47 casually walks around, hidden in plain sight, looking for the best way to eliminate his quarry. And there are so many different ways of doing that. The amount of different experiences people could have with this game was something to behold, and made Blood Money feel like nothing else. IO really captured the magic in a bottle with this one, which made it all the more shocking when they basically let it all go again with the utterly disappointing Absolution. At least they're trying to get that magic back now, but there are very few sequels that truly show a completed vision quite like this one does. By this point you may well figure that the Mega Drive has more titles than any other system in this list, and you'd be right. Gain Ground is kinda confusing at first, especially when you treat it just like any basic top-down shooter. You might wonder what the fuss is all about until suddenly you get what it's going for. It's more of a puzzle strategy type game, figuring out the best and quickest way to beat the level, ideally while also obtaining more characters for the battles ahead and not having to drag every one of them through to the exit. Defeating every enemy on a stage can be quite the test at times, and few games can force you to scramble quite as much as this one when the best laid plans suddenly hit a snag due to a stray arrow or bullet. The War Through the Ages supercomputer premise is something to get a kick out of as well, but what we end up with here is one of the most in-depth console games of its time, and when it grabs you, you'll understand. It's taken kind of a long time for an all-out shooter to appear on this list. Indeed, ultimately there was only space for a couple of them, and they're both by Cave. There's just something about bullet hell that appeals to me. Ratchets the intensity of a shoot-'em-up up by a factor of 10, comes with all sorts of pretty patterns and high-level graphics. They're hard to learn and master, but the best of them can be played reactively, on the edge of your seat. Such is the case with Mushihimesama, or Bug Princess. It's certainly one of the more anime games on the list, but that can't be held against it when the shooting is this good. One of Cave's more straight-ahead games in the end is quite monstrously appealing, whether it's an original arcade version, lucky you, a fine PS2 port that had some actually quite useful slowdown, or an excellent modern package on Steam. It's a definite favourite all the way. I'm not actually that much of a handheld gamer. That's something you may have been able to guess from this list so far. And yet, there are exceptions, particularly on the Nintendo DS, a system I absolutely loved. And for me, only one game, or series of games, represents that. Phoenix Wright. The first game is the one that's up here, but really, this is a nod for the whole series. Once you get past the high-octane lawyer presentation and the big shouts of objection, you end up with one of the best adventures around. A very snappy and witty script, some truly memorable characters, and a surprising amount of emotion, pathos, and things to say about the Japanese legal system. No amount of badly voiced Let's Plays on YouTube can take that away. These DS games were and are my favourite straight up adventure titles, without a shadow of a doubt. You knew this one was coming, right? There's no way this list could not have sensible soccer on it. When you've written so much about one game already, it can be a little tricky to know what precisely there is to say, especially when you know it's not even the only iteration on the list. The original Sensi is more than just a football game. It's a game that in every way is made to be fluid. You never have to stop for anything. When you play this game, everything you need is right there in a split second. No need for a radar or anything like that, just pass, move, and eventually shoot. A legendary footy game with a big dollop of arcade sensibility, and if Sensible Software hadn't made anything else aside from this, they'd still go into the Hall of Fame. Portal 2 may have had the highest expectations of any sequel ever, after the first game came out of, well, nowhere to be one of the most acclaimed games of them all. They were expectations that the game couldn't possibly have hoped to match, and yet it comes damn close. There's still all the fun of thinking with portals and puzzling around all over the place, alongside a few tweaks and additions, a much bigger plot, and of course, lots and lots of laughs. It's more than enough for Portal 2 to be able to stand on its own, with the somewhat bittersweet note tacked on that it may well go down as Valve's last great single-player game. Finally, we've got ourselves some wrestling. With the amount of hours I've put into wrestling games, there's no way a couple weren't going to make the list, and the best ever SmackDown game certainly warrants an entry. Here comes The Pain Has It All, an absolutely fantastic roster which shows off just how stacked the company were at the time, and it's the best that the gameplay got before the game just ended up getting too bloated and laborious to play. It's the point where the wave broke, but everything about it is truly awesome. From simple bouts in the ring to all the gimmick matches, and the backstage fights where you could still do silly unrealistic things like jump off of a helicopter. The only shame is that this was a mark that the series would never ever, and has never even come close to, again. With the amount of open world sandbox games on here, there's no way I couldn't mention the original sandbox. I am preparing something altogether bigger on Elite for the future, but for now, well, what can be said? I mean, I may have been a bit young for the original micro version, but this here's my jam, Elite Advanced on the Amiga. Once again, you go on an expedition with no serious direction, and you do what you like. Will you trade illicit goods? Will you be a privateer? Will your adventure be unceremoniously cut short by a chance meeting with multiple Fargoids outside Leasty? There is so much to do. When the original came out, people almost couldn't take it in, just how massive this game was. I mean, how could you possibly? They're still wondering how on earth it happened now. Quite possibly the most important game in British software history, with a fearsome reputation to match, but it's not like it doesn't play damn good too. Flashback is another pretty obvious one. I have played this game, wire to wire, countless times since 1993. This was something altogether different for a wee bairn raised on arcade games and traditional platformers. A slow, considered game with human-like movement, plunging you into a mysterious world. Back then, I loved Flashback for those differences. Nowadays, I love Flashback for that and plenty more. All of its affable movie callouts, the quality of the cutscenes and animation, the cinematic music stins, and how much it feels like travelling through a damn good sci-fi flick, with a quality of narrative you didn't get too often back in the day. But at its heart, there is still the fumbling around in an alien and dangerous place that was the first reason why it appealed to me so damn much, and I can't ever envision the game not being high in a list like this. Speaking of cinematic experiences, that's just one of the many things that made this next monster stick out. Half-Life 2, one of the greatest sequels ever, was packed full of them, more outrageous stunts than had probably been seen in an FPS game up to that point. Oh, and there was also those physics which allowed you to do things like kill enemies by chucking bins at them. And so Half-Life 2 is something of a mixture between new approaches inspired by the rules of film and old classic computer game anarchy. There was nothing like it, and they called it one of the best games ever for a bunch of pretty damn good reasons. It was so bold that in one fell swoop, if you're so inclined, it could have rendered every other FPS that preceded it obsolete. The only crime is that the story was never, and will never be bloody finished. On a recent list made by a certain Mr. DJ Slope, this game made number 1. Here Sonic 3 and Knuckles makes number 34. It may not be the best game of all time for me, but it's still obviously one of the best 16-bit platformers of them all. A big old journey with two carts happily fused together, these games are quite clearly meant to be experienced as one. You can certainly argue that platformer graphics on the Mega Drive never managed to meet this mark before or afterwards, that the classic Sonic style of play is fully retained with much needed extras and plenty of secrets to find, that the worlds just feel that more alive, and that the length of the journey is more than enough to class this as something of a 16-bit epic. All these things would be correct, and it's got such a nice placing for many a good reason. And yet it's not quite my favourite Sonic. That's still to come. Like Space Harrier 2 many entries ago, the original arcade classic is ruled out in favour of a more modern take. But this is different. This in every way is how you properly modernise a game, to the point where it is absolutely superior. A big mixture of the excellent Outrun 2 and Outrun 2 SP, Coast to Coast lets you power slide around all over the place, streak through the rival slipstreams, and take your girl to wherever she wants at top speed in a monstrously fast sports car. You've got the classic music but rearranged and kicked up a notch. There's some of the most gorgeous surroundings you'll find in any car game. It's just beautiful. One of the best arcade games ever, becoming even better in the home. As an aside, this would have gone to the even better HD version, Outrun Online Arcade on the Xbox 360, if that game was still available. Alas, it isn't. But Coast to Coast is still damn brilliant regardless. Another one of those games that just took over my life for a period. I did everything in Super Meat Boy. I even managed to 100% it and become a golden god, which was certainly quite the trip. Collecting all those bandages, getting the fast times, spending literally days trying to beat the kids' warp zone. And for all the many deaths, the game never stopped being a laugh. An ultra fast platformer with classic Mario style controls and a nice little line in gross out humour, the game was almost tailor made for me to love it. It's got a style about it that still feels very homemade in spite of all the plush, and there's obviously a ton of love directed to both classic NES games and new indie darlings alike in this package. And there were few feelings more satisfying as the one I got when I finally unlocked that damn kit. Of all the games in the top 100, this may be the one that I've played the most. And sure, there may be a new HD game out that's all damn good and so on, but it would be wrong to not put Fire Pro Returns here. This was meant to be the last Fire Pro, the game that would have to tide all the fans of it over forever. It didn't need to in the end, but it certainly did more than enough to keep the fires burning and keep folks like me going for well over a decade. It had everything you could possibly need to keep a whole world of wrestling going, and the matches crucially felt like a proper wrestling match. Niche game it may be, but for those who love it, it can just take over. I should know, I have put thousands of hours into FPR, and even if Fire Pro World means I may never end up touching it again, if it wasn't for that unexpected arrival, I would still happily be putting time into it now, seeing what the latest creations are, making up some lovely dream matches, being super nerdy and building a Fed. God, I love wrestling, and I love Fire Pro. The ultimate early arcade game. It made number 1 on a list of such things before, and it's still the best of them today. Missile Command is absolutely of its time. Such a game could only come from early 80s fear and paranoia, and the idea that the atomic fires were so close. For all that this may be an immensely playable game of defence, it's so evocative that it actually ended up giving its creator some serious recurring nightmares. Relatively speaking, it's a bit sparser than some of the more full-on classic arcade games we've seen already, but that only adds to the game's feel. It allows you to truly fill in the blanks. Those aren't simply lines coming down that you're firing dots at. They're Soviet missiles, and those dots are the last line of defence. The only thing that's keeping you from, well, as the game oh so bluntly puts it once the last city falls, the end. A legend of a game, so long as it doesn't give you nightmares as well. One of my absolute favourite gaming memories, quite simply, was the first time that I played Dodonpachi. It was pretty much the first time I'd played any bullet hell type game, and in short, it completely blew me away. I was infatuated with it. Sure, I wasn't any good at it and died an awful lot, but that didn't matter. It was one of the craziest and most intense gaming experiences I'd ever bloody had. Just, good lord. Trying to dodge all those bullets while firing off some pretty big weapons yourself was really something. I still kinda get that feeling when I play the game now, meaning that this original is without any question my favourite ever shoot 'em up. No surprises there, I guess. There'd been a couple of close ones before this, but Dodonpachi was arguably the game that gave birth to a whole new subgenre and a whole new way of doing shmups that ended up being right up my street. I wouldn't say that Bayonetta quite came out of nowhere, but its sheer greatness was a little bit of a shock, as good as it looked in previews and ads and all of that. I just get an endless kick out of this one through every little thing. Every time you successfully dodge and engage witch time, every time you pull off those awesome combos and nutty wicked weave moves, every time there's some little tribute to an old Sega classic, and of course all the awesome things that Bayonetta does. She, the witch with the costume made out of her hair, the endless sexy poses and non-stop badassery, might be my favourite character in all of video games. She makes Lara Croft look like Mary Whitehouse. Speaking of which, fighting against all the combined forces of heaven? Not only is that in classic bad taste, but who knew that they'd look and be so damn vicious as well? Everything about this game is just super smashing great. The action never stops. Shinobi 3. Again, the first time I played this is just etched onto my brain. As a youngling, I often travelled with my dad as he did sales stuff, and we were around somebody's house who so happened to have another kid with a Mega Drive. I never met the kid before or after, but he showed me Shinobi 3, and for that I am eternally grateful. I kinda had to have the game immediately after that. This game just goes all out. Within 10 minutes you've already dive kicked countless enemies, you've gone hand over waterfalls, you've ridden on horseback, soon you'll be surfing too, and you'll be jumping on falling frickin' rocks. There's so much packed into this gem. I barely even have time to mention the amazing boss battles, the music, the simple fact that every last bit of this game is legendary. What a title. The best ninja game of them all. Again, this is a game that I have said so much about, I kinda wonder what else I can say. Sensible Software knew they had a good line with little people thanks to Sensible Soccer, so they decided to take those little people and shoot them. Lots of them. Cannon Fodder, with its mouse-driven action and sardonic, oh-so-British take on war, is another classic, of course. It's all about keeping your party alive for as long as possible, making sure they increase in rank so that they become better, even becoming a little bit attached to them. And it's likely that as soon as that happens, they'll get annihilated in a second by a rocket launch that you weren't aware of, meaning that the cycle starts anew, over and over, with the same thing happening until ultimately you aren't even bothering to remember the names of the latest group going out there. They are, after all, cannon fodder. And, it goes without saying, this was another legendary title from the UK's champions. There are so many good memories associated with Street Fighter 2. For example, I remember hanging around the machine in various arcades as a mere stripling, challenging people to a fight, and usually either losing or being told to fuck off. Obviously I remember playing it a lot too. With that and everything else, it was kind of a good time to have lots of arcades around. But here I've gone for the classic no-frills SNES version. As big on the Mega Drive as I was, when Street Fighter 2 was going to be on that system, I kinda had to have it. And it was absolutely worth it. I played it so much, ended up beating it with every character. I kinda should be really good at the game as a result of that, although of course I am not in the slightest. Somehow a dial sim that concentrates on craftily flighted dive bombs doesn't really work out. Still, this list would obviously be incomplete without SF2. This was the game that christened my first ever actually half decent PC. A positively beastly 800MHz machine running Windows ME, bought from tiny computers. It had like 30GB of space, which was crazy. I mean, you couldn't possibly fill that up. Half-Life 1, as shown here in its fine and ragdolly Source Engine edition, was obviously another big game changer with a great plot, a new approach to cutscenes, and a crowbar-wielding scientist who, in my hands, was usually quite fond of activating the console, getting a bunch of weapons, and shooting all the other scientists at the start of the game. Once I'd finished doing that for a bit though, the actual game was the most immersive and atmospheric thing I'd played to date. Again, this story really does need to be finished at some point, guys. Just don't leave us hanging like that. Finally, a little Italian plumber enters. Well, sort of. He's actually only here in baby form as you control Yoshi, or various Yoshis, through a game that's wildly imaginative, filled with childlike wonder, insanely beautiful, and all the other cliches you can think of. And it's also a game where you quite literally eat your enemies, shit them back out in egg form, and then chuck them at other enemies. If that's not reason enough why this game should take such a high spot, I don't know what is. In all seriousness though, Yoshi's Island is really something quite special. A late SNES game that served as one of the last finishing touches to the glorious 16-bit era, and one of Shigeru Miyamoto's best and most unique creations. We're back to the squared circle with the top arcade game on this list. We've had a few, but there couldn't be anything else. If I could have one cabinet and one only, I would choose WrestleFest in a heartbeat. I started going to the arcades not long after I started becoming a wrestling fan, and the immediate fact that there was a game where I could play as all the big hulking superstars that I was watching on telly set me up to love both things for life. It may not be the most in-depth wrestling game or anything, but it's special, and it is a fine arcade basher. Even if there is a bittersweet twinge that you get when you look at the roster and just realise how many of them died before their time, the memories associated with this game are too special for it not to take this rightful spot. Some may think that Bushido Blade is kind of bare compared to a lot of fighting games. Some may not understand it because they're not following sword fighter etiquette and thus losing. Some may want something a little more bombastic. But for me, this is the best fighting game ever. It's all I want. A fight to the death that goes on for as long as it takes, where one false move can mean the end. It's all about finding that perfect moment, and when it comes off, there is no better feeling. It's all about Red Shadow and her sabre, or Utsasemi's katana, Black Lotus's rapier, any one of several legendary combinations. It's the classic Japanese cinematic sword fight, the one that's not so much about the violence as it is the sheer anticipation. Again, best fighting game ever. Nothing else comes near it. Now, if this list was for the top 100 most addictive games, there's no question about it. This would be number one. It's funny really, I never got too much into the original Binding of Isaac, but Rebirth is probably more addictive than crack cocaine. Not that I would know. I mean, it is in many ways gambling. You roll the dice whenever you play to see what tools you'll end up with. Sometimes it feels as though the game loves you as you get a build that basically makes winning a foregone conclusion before you leave the basement. Sometimes the game hates you and gives you the worst items possible. But it's not all bad. Sometimes, through skill, intuition, a little bit of cunning, and some luck, even out of a load of rubbish, you can pull through and get a winning run. I've been through all these permutations and more, enough to get my Mega Satan badge even. I've probably done enough with the game at this point, but if the videos ever completely dry up for whatever reason, chances are pretty good that I've fallen into the pit of Isaac again. Here we go then, with another blistering arcade experience home Sega Mega Drive title. When previously you'd only played rather plodding computer editions of Strider made by US Gold, suddenly finding this? That's kind of a difference maker. A game that truly demonstrates the leap forward that you've just taken with your brand new sleek black box of tricks. Strider is just full on. It never stops with the big old stunts, the frenzied climbing of walls, the rush down a slope and leap over the abyss, fighting the core of Balog in the anti-gravity chamber. It's a whole collection of moments that you don't forget in a hurry, complete with the signature shock of the blade and an unending supply of enemies to be put down. If only it had been followed by a sequel not made, again, by US Gold. For that matter, if only the modern Strider had decided to follow this example instead of all things, taking inspiration from the bloody NES game. Still, this original utterly stands on its own. Civilization 2. The multimedia Civilization, in many ways. It's rather a good game to demonstrate all the fun times of the CD-ROM age. We've got all those videos for the wonders of the world, there's music now all over the shop, but of course, more than anything, we have the Immortals, the legendary Civilization High Council, easily accessible and ready to offer advice in grainy MPEG-1 form at all times, and usually at each other's throats. That aside, this is, once again, Civilization, this time in isometric form, and as comically addicting as ever. It was this sequel that would happily see the game become a long-term institution, and it was also one of the few games my awful PC could actually run, meaning that many hours were lost to it. And you know what? It still runs without any problems whatsoever on modern machines. No complaints, noble leader. The ultimate in aforementioned Sega Channel gems, the Mega Drive Shadowrun never came out here, only in the US. Again, until that big old cartridge was stuck into our Mega Drive and, right away, this game was available. Mega Drive Shadow One is kind of like an open world. There's a story to follow, but in many ways you're on your own, and there's plenty of fun to be had cruising around and taking various jobs. There's even a whole world outside of the streets in cyberspace to explore, the chance to take on huge corporate networks, find big files and sell them for an even bigger score. There is lots to do, it's got a darker than usual atmosphere for a 16-bit game, and it was just so very much up my street at the time. Rather than go ahead and stick all the classic Mario games in individually, it's probably more accurate for me to go for this classic SNES package. I didn't have a NES or anything growing up, so Super Mario All-Stars really was the first time that I'd played these games properly. Before then, my only Mario experience was in those old choose-your-own-adventure books. Unsurprisingly, these games, beefed up in 16-bit form, were pretty damn brilliant. I would say that Super Mario Bros. 3 is my favourite of the lot, although I do still have more than a little bit of a soft spot for the original. Lost Levels and SMB 2 certainly got a lot of love to boot. It was, and still is, a package that's the perfect introduction for anyone who's not played these games. Even if, everyone probably has played them by now. The Metal Gear Solid hype train. That was special. I mean, it really was. When this title started getting hype from the PlayStation magazines, it looked like the new best thing ever. And well, it was. I spent pretty much the whole first day I got it, playing it, completing it, and it wasn't long after that before I went back and did it all over again. I still do it every so often. The original Metal Gear Solid is just quite special. It's still the wonder on the PS1. Sure, it kind of ends up being a boss rush near the end, and you do get lots of backtracking, but the boss fights, especially the fuckery of Psycho Mantis, the epic cutscenes, and of course Solid Snake himself, they just make it. The thriller plot is one thing, but Hideo Kojima just loves to play around with that and make it entirely his own, with all the melodrama and strangeness that you can eat. Just, what a game. Some games don't have a massive amount of nostalgia associated with them. Some games are this high up purely on merit. Super Castlevania 4 is one of those. It wasn't a game I played as a child, ultimately experiencing it for the first time on good old Z-SNES. And for me, it's the best entry in a series that I love. It is of course basically a reimagining and extension of the first game that we've already seen on this list. The journey to the castle is now here, along with a far bigger and fuller journey once you actually get inside of it. The little additions, such as being able to whip in more directions, even that also amusing lame whip, actually help things along, make it flow that bit more. Whenever I go through this game, it just gives me an immense feeling of satisfaction, especially when Dracula is finally taken down. It's not the toughest Castlevania, but it doesn't need to be. It is the perfect, iconic game in the series. This was my favourite game for quite a long time, and today it is still pretty high up there. Syndicate might be the darkest game on the whole list. In a dystopian future, it's so easy to control people's minds, the corporations have taken over, and they're now fighting one another, in the form of these groups of drug and cyberware-addled super soldiers. They care not about laying entire cities to waste in order to get one over the other. You almost don't think about that when playing the game, the people who constantly get caught up in it as one group meets the other and they exchange gunfire. It's almost as if they don't matter. More of a tactical shooter than a strategy game, Syndicate's gameplay is certainly top-notch, but it's the darkness that makes it something more special. The best game that Peter Molyneux and Bullfrog ever had a hand in. I wonder if this game's sequel will be up here eventually, whenever I finally decide to actually play it. It's possible. For now, Red Dead Redemption was something of a new approach to the typical open world sandbox of fun, and if you've been following this list so far, you know that such games usually involve my character being a sadistically evil arsehole. Not so here. I never did much of that in Red Dead. It just didn't feel right. John Marston is that strong a character that it would feel weird if all of a sudden I rode through the town shooting everyone and everything I saw. The character is so good, it changes the way you play. It didn't matter though, when you could take your horse down the line, getting into all sorts of different adventures, or just admiring the utterly beautiful Wild West landscape. Rockstar already had the king of the sandbox games on their books, and with this game they basically managed to create their alternative, and maybe surprisingly, produce something about as grown up as games have ever gotten. Sonic 3 and Knuckles gets more love these days, but for me, my favourite Sonic will always be number 2. The hype for this one started with a previously mentioned vid highlighting the games of 1992, with Sonic 2 as the obvious headliner. As the sequel to such a huge hit, it had so much to live up to, and yet it's simply better in every way. It looks nicer, it adds the spin dash, the levels are amazing, the special stages are better, and I don't even hate Tails like a lot of people do. Pretty much as soon as you get into the chemical plant zone and that indelible funky music kicks in, you just knew that this was going to be way better than what had come before, and it stayed that way right to the finish. No filler whatsoever, and the absolute best that the blue spiky hedgehog has ever been. Finally then, we're in the top 10, and we start with a game that of course came out of nowhere. People didn't know an awful lot about Portal other than it being an addition to the orange box, but then when people played it, it was a complete revelation. I still play through it from time to time because it's possibly a flawless hour and a half or so of gaming. Obvious memes aside, the script and plot is still hilarious, but the Portal based gameplay was an entirely different approach to puzzling that ended up being ripped off by, well, a lot of people. And not just for puzzles either. GLaDOS is still one of my favourite ever characters in video games too. I mean, that's hardly a surprise. The ending, that's just fantastic as well. Again, there's no filler in it. For the short time the game's around, it's simply perfect, and it ended up being the best thing in a compilation that was filled with nothing but classics. If only Valve would do such things again. Guys, we miss you. Come back to what you know. For years, this was a game that everyone had hyped so much. Super Metroid this, best game ever that. I didn't play it back when it was out, and always couldn't help wondering just what the fuss was all about. And so, eventually I played it. Not necessarily with overly high expectations, but curious as to what it would be like. And I found that everything people had been saying about this being one of the best games ever was absolutely true. Turns out that Super Metroid, with its mix of pitch-perfect platforming, alien adventures, power-up collecting, dramatic boss fights, and a great story bubbling under the surface, is actually that damn good. More than that, it's the best game on the SNES, a system that, even if my heart will always remain with my beloved Mega Drive, is still a machine that I love dearly. Platform-wise, Super Metroid is as good as it gets. For me, the best ever. Another game that you clearly knew was coming, Streets of Rage 2 takes a rightful place in the top 10. Some may actually wonder what's so special about it compared to a whole load of other beat-em-ups where you walk right and force various goons to suck sidewalk. And I'm not sure myself, but there is something. The sheer coolness of the characters, the beautiful stages, Yuzo Koshiro's pounding club-style music. Many other beat-em-ups were good, a few were great, but Streets of Rage 2? Just, when you hit that first level boss and the rain's pouring down, you know there's a touch to this one that you just don't get anywhere else. It's amazing. And yet, it's not the top Mega Drive game on the list. That one's coming. A lot of these games are mainly on here because they're a lot of fun, and they have good memories attached to them. Silent Hill 2 may not exactly be fun. It's a grim slog through the fog, as James tries to figure out just what has brought him to this strange place. The result in the end is quite powerful, even if there are parts where you may want to look away. The way the true nature of James's quest gradually becomes ever clearer is quite possibly the high watermark for storytelling in a video game, and it hardly compromises on the game front either. It's not for the timid, but it's a game that will stick with me for life. You didn't think that MGS1 was going to be the only entry for the series, did you? This one had to be here, as it is unquestionably my favourite. It may well have been the greatest troll in video games, to promise Solid Snake all through the hype, and then do a big old mid-game switch up to Raiden. What follows is the most glorious, over-the-top, thoroughly meta story, a full-blown dose of Kojima, complete with ludicrous attention to detail, headbands that give you infinite ammo, a kernel that sinks ever further into madness, a fight with a seemingly endless supply of Metal Gears that's almost designed to purposefully wreck their mystique and uniqueness. It's almost as if Kojima tried to tear down everything that made the first game, but in a very specific and utterly genius way. Sometimes you just can't get your head around it. And for this and many reasons, MGS2 is one of my very favourite games. You just don't get people being allowed to mess around in this way with such a big game anymore. The few RPGs that I have played from end to end do certainly appear to have made their way to the top of the list, this being just another. Phantasy Star 4 is a game I actually covered quite early on in my YouTube career, almost as a more detailed first impression, but when I went back to it and played the game in full, I fell totally in love. For me, it's the best 16-bit RPG, a story filled with heroic moments, tragedy, and an ultimate battle seemingly with fate and time itself. Not to mention that it gets the mechanics so right with its amazing battle system, and it was one of the last great releases for the Mega Drive 2, a perfect way for the system to sign off, with what for me is the best game ever released on it. It was really close between this and Streets of Rage 2, seriously, but in the end, Phantasy Star 4 just has to be the one, a monumental achievement. It took me so long to finally play Doom properly. Sure, there was the SNES version that I still have a soft spot for, clunky though it may be, but it was years later, when I found a copy of Doom 95 at a boot sale, that I finally had this game to play. And despite many years of acclaim and anticipation, it was worth waiting for. The original Doom still has something, all these years later. It's still relentless, it's still labyrinthine. It's even still very scary and atmospheric in parts due to the way that Carmack and company used lighting and constantly made you feel uncomfortable. But the ultimate satisfaction comes when you're ripping and tearing through endless hordes of hell's best, bringing the pain as only a space marine on a one-man suicide mission can. It is still the greatest first-person shooter of all time, without a shadow of a doubt. I couldn't not have the original Sensei, and not also have SWOS. It's Sensible Software's greatest achievement. They set out to create a living encyclopedia of world football, and that's exactly what they did. They made a game you can lose yourself in, where you can spend 20 in-game years constructing a football life that could take you almost anywhere in the world, possibly even to the glory of managing your national team. There's thousands of teams, tens of thousands of players, and the game still plays the best and most flowing, wonderful football you can possibly experience. It was such an achievement that someone even saw fit to say it was amongst the most important games ever made, something not just for John Hare, but the entire UK game scene to be more than a little bit proud of. Everyone has their favourite Grand Theft Auto, of course, and this is mine, always has been, always will be. San Andreas took on a new setting, an early 90s LA soaked in movies like New Jack City and Boys in the Hood that hadn't exactly been touched by a lot of games, and used it for something that, more than just a GTA, was almost like a life simulator with guns. It's got the best GTA plot, a star-studded cast of brilliant characters played by big names giving fantastic performances, a whole load of the game's best ever missions, and a main character who moves out of the hood to become a jacked up landowner come expert pilot come super spy come crooked cop killer. GTA obviously remained excellent after this game, but I don't know if it will ever be able to match the story of one Carl Johnson. A game that even in such an amazing era is without even the semblance of an equal. And at last, we're here. The number one probably doesn't come as any surprise at all. Surely you knew, in the back of your mind, that it would be Final Fantasy VII. Hell, I already said it was my favourite game ever at the end of my gargantuan review of it, and that's not changed since. This was, of course, the reason why I wanted a PS1 so much, that old hype again, delivering. I really don't know what more I can say about FF7 because it is such an important game to me, and even on playing it again, it always seems to reveal that little bit more, some other theme which I previously hadn't noticed. It manages to cover quite a lot of bold subjects and certainly dark themes for the time, while also having the best villains and, of course, the video game equivalent of Luke, I am your father. When I play this game, and I certainly still do from time to time, I always seem to experience these things as if I'm seeing them for the first time, because the pull of FF7 is so strong. Right from the beginning, it's like coming back home, without even trying, bringing you back once more. It's my favourite game of all time, and I'm pretty sure that by this point, 20 years down the road, it's always going to be. And so, that's that. Thanks for joining me on this, my personal top 100. What a fun time I had playing all these games once again. A good way to spend the quiet month, methinks. I'll be back soon with some other strange and wonderful topic, I'm sure, but for now, I'll say, as always, bye for now. Thanks for watching this big old top 100. If you like this video then please do like it, please do follow me on all my social media links, and also support me on Patreon, where you can be amongst the great and the good listed here. Alexander Jazeri, Andrew Dalton, Andy Capt, Asobi Kwan DX, Chris, Conrad Pritchard, Daniel Briggs, Daniel Dave Taylor, Dave Cork, David Rose, Dustin Cooper, Gary Pinkett, Gary Samaden, Geordie Alex, James Loveridge, Jason Stevens, Jace Alexander, Lee Norris, Lorne Daniel, Martin Pataki, Nicholas Tristan, Peter Jack, Phil Taprog, Potter Margel, Pixels Limited, Ren Bimon, Rock 2000, Seth Robinson, Simon Gulliver, Yoka Operator, Zach Roach, and to all the rest of the community, thank you so much, and goodbye.